Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back. Here's another video. This is mostly intended for students in my online painting class. But if you're watching this and you're not part of my online painting class, that's okay. You're welcome to follow along and see what we're working on. I'm going to be talking about and sharing how I begin a painting that follows the parameters of Project 3, which is all about appropriating work from historical artists and how we can use the ideas or some of the formal components to a historical painting as a place of inspiration, and how we can take things and build on them or transform them or evolve them into other imagery and other ideas that are more personally relevant to us. So this past week in class, I introduced the project and gave some examples of how I began the designing thumbnail stage of the project. So the artist who I'm pulling inspiration from is the Belgian painter Rene Magritte, and he was a surrealist painter alive at the beginning, kind of turn of the 20th century, going into kind of the modernist period. A lot of his work tied back into the surrealist movement. He was friends with a lot of the kind of key surrealists, including Andre Breton. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but the artwork that I really enjoy from Rene Magritte kind of presents things that we typically see or are quite familiar with in our everyday life, but in a way that feels new or different, or maybe a little off-putting, or even just sort of uncanny and strange. And I've always gravitated towards imagery and media and art that kind of plays with the expectations of the viewer, and takes something that is first, certainly recognizable, as we can see some examples of his paintings here. But he plays with things like scale. He explores things like the figure and the body and identity, and he pushes us to think about our own experience in new ways, and maybe in a way that we don't typically pursue on a daily basis. So there's this sort of encounter with his imagery that feels unique to him as an artist, and I've always really enjoyed that about his work. And so basically, as the instructions for our project sort of state and encourage, I looked at his full portfolio or oeuvre, and started looking through images that maybe could inspire ideas that felt personal to me, or that felt really interesting. So this was an example of one of the paintings that I had kind of bookmarked and saved, and I found a few other examples of paintings kind of made in this same theme, in this same train of thought and kind of lineage with his process. So there were a few of these that really stood out to me that I really liked, and from that point then, what I did is I downloaded copies of these images and kind of pulled them into my own space and started to experiment with thumbnail drawing. So this is what I showed my students, and if you're one of my students, this is what we saw in one of our recent classes. But basically, I took this sort of framework as a conceptual and also a compositional device, and started to play around with things that I could bring into this juxtaposition of the interior versus the exterior. And because we have this sort of break in the wall between those two spaces, we see two things at the same time. And I really like that sense of immediacy, and that sense of duality, of two things kind of coexisting at the same time. So these were my thumbnail sketches that I came up with and that I showed my class, and I have the sketchbook here that I made these thumbnails on. So the assignment that we have is to make a painting that is 18 inches by 24 inches. They have about 2 weeks, a little more than 2 weeks, I think, to make this painting. But starting off with this process where we're sourcing imagery, we are playing around with the compositions, we're coming up with our own versions of compositions, we're allowing the process to be very open-ended. So this was my spread in my sketchbook of ideas, which I've scanned and then put into this document that we're looking at right now. So you can kind of get a quick sense of my 3 ideas. And typically, if I was going to do a painting and I had all the time in the world, it would be nice to have 5 or 10 or 20 thumbnails to really flesh out the idea a little bit more and just come up with some more options. But for the sake of time and the experiment of this project, I just came up with these 3. Each of these thumbnails is 4 inches by 3 inches. So the ratio follows the same ratio as an 18 by 24 inch panel. Or as we can see here, this is a 12 by 9 sheet of primed paper that I'll be making my demo painting on. And the next thing that I wanted to just sort of share was, with each of these I took on 3 very different concepts. So this was the first sketch that I made, and in this painting or idea, I was really thinking about the environment, thinking about fire breaching this interior safe domestic space, and just the sense of urgency and anxiety that kind of comes with that sort of an image I thought would be really interesting to paint in a static image. The one below that was the second concept that I came up with, and another thing that I noticed about Rene Magritte's paintings is that he often plays around with fragments of the figure, and sometimes he has the figure sort of repeated in space. Sometimes he has, pieces or fragments of the anatomy, like we'll see, like eyes will be painted on other forms and figures. You can kind of see that over in this image. Here's another one that, comes to mind. And I just like that playfulness of information, of scale, of obfuscation of information, and also that kind of universal opportunity for the viewer to enter the work, right, and to be able to insert oneself into this sort of visual puzzle. I thought was really interesting. So in this sketch, I was imagining this sort of like interior room, again playing with doors or windows, and thinking about the figure as this enlarged sense of scale, kind of entering into this personal space, I thought would be really interesting. So I have this really large scale nose that kind of disrupts the blinds. That was the initial idea. He also includes a lot of these little top hats in his paintings, and I thought that would be kind of an interesting little nod to his work. So that was sort of the second idea I came up with. And then the third idea, which is I think the one I'm going to end up going with, was this concept that I was imagining of a fresh body of water, or just a very large body of water. It could be anywhere, but for me, in my mind, this is Lake Michigan. It's very close to where I live, and I've spent a lot of time along the coast of Lake Michigan, so it feels personal to me. I like this idea of this doorway that is sort of installed on this shallow sort of beach of Lake Michigan, where the water is wrapping around the base of the door, connecting the two in space, where it feels a little bit more real. And then in that doorway that's open, there would be this very private sort of community of structures that are human-made. And I like that contrast of a natural environment with a human-made environment being shown together. And I'm still already kind of playing with ideas in my head of maybe I'll have multiple fences where it's like you just can barely see the community. I think that's an interesting idea, and it felt very timely for things that are happening not far from where I live. So I like the open-endedness of this image, and just the opportunities to play around with color and color properties. So I think I'm going to go with this as my reference, and basically I'll be leaving this image up on my computer as I'm starting to sketch and block in the painting. But the main part of this video is to show to my students how I begin a painting, like as an example, and things that can be maybe helpful in terms of the process. So I just thought it would be helpful for anyone else who's watching this video to see the background of the process, to see a little bit more of the context in terms of the inspiration for my painting, but also, you know, what we're doing with this project at large. So I have my streaming software open here, and basically I'm going to switch things back to my camera. So I'll talk a little bit here about what I'm using and how I'm going to essentially construct the painting. So project 3, again, some of this is review if you're in my class and you're watching this video. Project 3 is all about using a complementary palette. So I'm asking my students to choose a complementary palette off of the traditional color wheels. So we've been mostly working with achromatic palettes, really focusing on things like value, trying to see relationships of light to dark in our images and our paintings. And now we're starting to kind of ease our way into using hues and other colors and chroma in our paintings. So as an example, I chose a yellow and violet complementary color scheme, which you can see here. This is a still wet little color chart that is also part of this assignment. So students are asked to make one of 2 color charts. They can either do a 10-step color chart with 2 different value columns, or they can do a 15-step color chart with 3 different columns. So the benefit of a 3-step one is you just get to see a little bit more of the range in your palette that you choose. So in this one, you know, between both of them, they're supposed to get to this fairly neutral color between their 2 complements. So the violet and the yellow palette that I picked that I'll be using for my painting is fairly warm overall, so we don't really get as neutral of a middle mixture between the 2. But on a palette like ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, you can get to a very, very achromatic middle neutral with a chart like that. So again, if you're watching this video and you're not in my class, but you are interested in painting or learning more concepts about painting, feel free to try any of these exercises. I think they're really, really beneficial in training our eyes to become more sensitive to properties of color and relative theory when we talk about color. And a lot of times people will say, oh, I want to study color theory, when really what we're talking about is relativism in color. So limiting our palette can really help us start to think about things like something being slightly warmer, slightly cooler, slightly more chromatic, slightly less chromatic, lighter, darker, right? So, but it's always in terms of a relationship between 2 different colors. So I'm just going to get a couple things set up here before I begin painting. I may also try to set up my thumbnail kind of near the easel if it's not too much of a pain. Here's my normal palette that I use that opens up. You can see where I keep most of my other colors, but I'm not going to be using this palette because you wouldn't be able to see it. So instead I'll be mixing everything on this other palette that I've had for a long time, which I've talked about in recent videos as well. So let's go ahead and set this up just for the start of my painting practice. I have it set up here on the base of my easel. Okay, so one thing that I also had mentioned to my students as a recommendation, if they had the time and they wanted to explore the palette a little bit more in depth, is that they could also make a color study prior to making their painting. So when I've said that, you know, here's kind of an example of what I mean, right? So once you have your thumbnail drawing, you can make a small color study of your idea prior to jumping into the larger painting. Especially for them, they're making a large 18-inch by 24-inch painting for this project. So, this will help you see some of those early possibilities for things like value, compression, contrast, temperature, zones. Where do they want their more chromatic, really intense colors in the painting? I didn't do that prior to this, so I'll just be kind of figuring that out as I go. But at some point in the semester, it would be nice to maybe spend some time demonstrating the benefits of making color studies in advance. So I'm going to do, let's grab a few brushes. And then just for the sake of the video, I'm using a few different pigments. So with a yellow and violet complementary color scheme, I chose a yellow, which is a very warm, opaque yellow, and that is cadmium yellow medium. And I tried to pick the same or fairly similar temperatures of pigments to what my students are using in my class. So cadmium yellow medium is my yellow, titanium white is my white, this is ultramarine blue, and then I have quinacridone magenta. And these two colors mix together to get this purple, this violet that I used in my color chart. Now I don't have them pre-mixed, so as I start working, I'm gonna make a pile of that. That way I'm starting with violet and the yellow and white. And if I run out of violet, then I'll just have to mix up more. But that's kind of the plan for the palette, just so you know. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that first. I'm gonna take a fairly large pile of the quinacridone magenta. Just going to get as much of that pigment down on the palette as possible, and then we'll grab a pretty healthy blob of ultramarine blue. Now, both of these pigments are transparent, so to kind of check the properties of the mixture, I can kind of just thin it out and then see where that color appears to be brighter because it's less opaque. That's one way to kind of gauge the mixture. The other sort of tip that I would recommend is to take a small amount of white and then on the periphery of your pile mix it with some of that color that you're looking at and that you're trying to make. So let's see how this looks with a little bit of white. I feel like this will be a pretty good place to start though. So if I grab a small amount of white, something like that, I can make a little pile over on the outside, grab a little bit of the violet that I have so far, and tint it up a little bit so I can read its properties. And that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that as my violet. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started then. So now, if you're watching this video, again, I'm mostly talking to my students here, but if you're going to be kind of painting along or using this as a reference for the process, the first thing I would do is try to figure out what your ideas are for the composition. So if I go back for a moment here and I go back down to my idea or my design. So if I bring this up so we can see the full design, let's zoom out just a hair. So what I have here is I have my horizon line, I have my kind of point of interest, my focal area, which is going to be sort of this information here. I have a lot of organic shapes down at the foreground that will, I think, play in an interesting contrast to a lot of the architectural lines in the buildings, in the fence, obviously in this big rectangle, and the horizon line. So I like that there's sort of this larger geometric architectural shape cluster, and how that will kind of play off of this organic foreground. But the main thing I'm trying to figure out right now is where are my colors, right? How do I want to set up the colors? So what I kind of think would be interesting is if I make this interior part of the painting one of the two complements primarily. So I could make this more of a purpley violet zone, and then the rest could be more yellow and more warm. Or I could flip that, and this could be warm, and the outside could be very cool with the violets and the kind of gray, greenish gray violets. I kind of like the first idea. I like the idea of this being warm on the outside and the inside being cool and just maybe less inviting. I think that fits the theme that I think about when I'm looking at this idea, this design. So I think that's the plan. I'm going to make this a little bit more dull and cold and cool, and then the natural outer sort of rectangle of the painting is going to be more of the yellows and the golds and those just in general warmer tones. So colors like these up at the top part of my chart will be, what will end up making most of this outer part of the painting. So, now that I have kind of like general ideas for the hues of my palette, now I can think about values, right? So if I want the sky to read as this bright, warm sky, I probably should save that for maybe like this yellow, the brighter yellow, and then I can use the darker, slightly darker yellows that I have for the water and for this information down at the bottom. And obviously I can still bring in some of these like kind of muted purpley brown colors for accents and maybe for areas that I don't want to be super chromatic. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. So I think that's enough information just to go ahead and start painting. But if you haven't figured out those parts of your idea, you might want to take a few minutes and just start to imagine how you want to lay out, at the very least, two big opposing parts of the painting in terms of your palette. So if you're using a red and green complementary palette, where is your red, like really, really red information versus your really, really green information? And that'll help you just kind of start to visualize the painting and the composition. And color can be a really helpful way to lead the viewer's eye or to do things like create contrast, right? So for me, I really want this area to feel separate from this area on the outside with the water. I don't want these to feel like they're the same place. So I'm going to push their contexts farther away by keeping one area, one end of the palette, and the other area, the other end of the palette. So I hope that makes sense. Again, the other thing I highly recommend is doing a few small color studies. Again, if I had planned a little bit more, I would have probably done one with this idea that I just went over. That way you could see what I'm going to do. But as I paint, you'll sort of see the same process. So let's get back to the other view and let's go ahead and start painting. So now that you kind of have an idea of what I'm thinking about with the painting, now I can start to talk more about color mixing and how I would recommend starting your painting. So I'm going to grab my lighter color, pure color. So I have a violet and I have a yellow. So my yellow is the lighter of the two. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of violet, and I want to mute this down slightly. So I want to get this as close to like the middle between the yellow and the violet in terms of this color feeling yellow or violet. So I don't want it to seem more violet, and I don't want it to seem more yellow. So it still seems like it's closer to yellow than it is to violet. So let's grab a little bit more violet, bring this in. And so this is how I should have probably talked about the color chart. Middle value is that you don't want that color to lean too much towards violet or yellow. You want it to feel like it's kind of in between the two. Which this might be pretty close to that point. And you can even like keep some of that pigment on the palette knife, hold it between the two, and it's like, does it feel like it's closer to one or the other? That's a way to kind of visualize that part of the mixing process. So this looks pretty good. Okay, I'm gonna grab a little bit of my white just to lighten this up a little bit, because the white is also going to take out some of the chroma, because titanium white is very opaque, and that's going to help this feel a little bit less intense. So what I'm trying to do is get to a color that I can use to start drawing my composition without using a color that's too intense in terms of chroma, but also in terms of hue. Okay, so now that I have kind of a neutral color, I have my Gamsol over here, and I'm just going to take the lid off for a second. I'm going to dip this brush into my Gamsol so that I can use a little bit of Gamsol to thin out my color, and then this little pile of paint that I just mixed is going to go a long way, right? This is going to allow me to make a lot of marks because there's not a whole lot of paint that's here. So I've thinned it out with a little bit of Gamsol. I can use my paper towel to help take some of the extra Gamsol out of the brush. But now with a synthetic round brush with a fairly kind of messy tip, right? This isn't a super sharp point that I have. I can start to go in and, sorry, I'm just going to adjust my phone here. I may have to do that a couple times during the recording, so I apologize for that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is just start to draw in, you know, as I'm looking down off camera. I have my thumbnail and my sketchbook open, and I'm going to also use a scrap piece of wood. This is a tool that I use all the time when I'm painting. It's just a scrap piece of wood that I've kept in my backpack. I use it in my studio, and over many painting sessions, it's created this, as you can see, this kind of shiny patina. But I use this as a straight edge tool when I'm painting. So this allows me to make really straight, continuous architectural lines, which is really handy, especially for a composition like this one with the door and the horizon line. So basically, I want to make this door shape as centered as possible. And I didn't measure it out. You know, with paint, we can always adjust things. So I don't typically take a ruler and try to perfectly measure things. I feel like that's not really the best use of my time. You know, but now I can start to lay out where the top of the door might be. Now I can figure out where the base of the door sits in the composition, which it looks like it's somewhere around here. Right, so already just with a few lines, I'm able to place the larger shapes of the composition. I'm not drawing with a pencil. You know, I'm using a brush that has a fairly relatively thin point compared to the space in the painting. Now with an 18 by 24 inch painting, you might be able to use a brush that's this big, and that line might feel as thin as these lines feel in comparison to the size of your panel. So when you're using and picking a brush, try to think about that. You know, what is the ratio between the line that you're getting from your brush and the size of your canvas or your panel that you're painting on? You know, and maybe it helps, or it would be better to use a bigger brush. Especially, I think early on like this, it can be helpful to use a larger brush, because that you know, speeds up our drawing process. I wouldn't use a super fine thin brush when you're sketching, you know, because for me, I feel like it's easy to get bogged down by the details, and at this point in the process, we really don't want to be distracted by details. We're just trying to find the larger relationships of space and proportions. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking my paper towel and I'm just going to soften the information. I don't remember if I mentioned this in this stream so far, but I'm painting on a piece of 12 inch by 9 inch printmaking paper. It's an archival acid-free paper. It's a pretty thick paper that has acrylic gesso, and then it also has a top coat of titanium oil ground, which has faded to this like beige color. But just so you know, what I'm painting on is fairly smooth in its texture. Okay, I'm going to grab a little bit more of my color here. And I'm going to start to kind of plan some of the marks down here at the base. I'm kind of drawing what my thumbnail had for information down at the bottom. You know, obviously I haven't mixed any other new colors. I'm just using that same muted color that I mixed up, which is a very harmonious color to the whole palette because it has, it has pieces of both of my mother colors, right? So my yellow and my violet, those are my mother colors. And then white is here just to tint and raise the value, while also decreasing some of the chroma in those mixtures. But because I'm using a color that has a little bit of technically all three of them, this is a very harmonious color to start with. And it's going to be a useful color that I can use to gauge other properties in the future mixtures that I'm going to be making. So let's see, I've got kind of the ripply water here. We can maybe reestablish the door frame here, make it a little bit thicker, a little bit darker. You know, there's always going to be moments while you're kind of laying in the foundation of your paintings where you can kind of start to get confused by what something is, and it never hurts to go back and reestablish some of that information. So with my brush, I'm basically taking a little bit more paint, right? So I'm kind of like moving my mixes or what I'm picking up in terms of the palette with this brush. You know, if I start to feel like this thin, mixture of Gamsol in the paint is a little too light, or it's not giving me the density of line that I want, I'll start to move my brush into a little bit more of the thicker paint. What I don't do is I don't take the brush and pick a huge glob of that paint and then go make a mark, right? I'm trying to keep the consistency of the paint relatively thin while I'm sketching and organizing my shapes and my lines, because I don't want to have to kind of fight with really thick paint as I'm trying to just establish and kind of resolve some of these foundational things in the painting. So that's why I would recommend also not using too much paint at this point in the process. Okay, so let's also just really quickly here reestablish this horizon line on the body of water. It looks pretty good. I might have to adjust some of that later. But again, this is just for me to kind of figure out where things are happening in the painting. So now what I'm going to do is mix up a few more colors. Let's see. So let's take some of my yellow, cadmium yellow, and let's put it right here. Let's grab a little bit of this middle brown mixture. And because there's more yellow than that middle mixture, this is going to be a lighter, more chromatic version, right? And when you're mixing your colors, a lot of times it's really helpful to mix in piles that make it easier for you to remember a few things. Number one, it's easier to remember how you got that mixture. Number two, you're placing that mixture next to another mixture that is slightly different. And by having them side by side, it's really easy to gauge what is different about the other one, right? So I know that this one is darker than this one. This one is feeling more chromatic than this one in terms of its intensity, in terms of its saturation, partially because it's made with mostly yellow, right? Now, if I took white, which I can show you here, if I take some of this white, I bring that down here, I take a little bit of this same middle mixture and mix that in down here. Now I can see how different this mixture is than this one here, partially because of the value, right? This is a lot brighter than this mixture, but also in terms of its temperature, right? So by adding more yellow, it's going to make this color a lot warmer, closer to yellow. By adding just white, it's going to make it cooler in temperature, which sometimes it's hard for us to tell and notice that because white is achromatic. It doesn't have any chroma of temperature of warm or cool. However, titanium white as a pigment, it tends to cool our mixtures slightly. So if you end up lightening or tinting a color, right, like I just did here, but you don't want it to be as cool in temperature, I would add a little bit of a warm, so in this case a yellow, and add that in, and it's going to make this feel a little less cool in temperature. It's going to start to warm that up, as you could tell right away, right? So that's something to think about as you're mixing colors, and if something is feeling a little too chalky or a little too cool, chances are you're probably forgetting to add in a little bit of a warmer addition to whatever you're mixing. So that's just something to be weary of. Not that it's good or bad, it's just part of the system of mixing colors. Now, the other thing is when you're mixing your piles, again, try to give yourself enough space where you have room to mix something else. And if you're going to be making adjustments with a brush as opposed to a palette knife, I would always try to be a little bit conservative with whatever mixture you're about to change. So you'll notice that when I wanted to make this yellow, I didn't take this entire pile and add yellow to it and change the whole pile, right? What I did is I took a chunk of this pile and added it to a new amount with yellow, right? So this is just a tip in terms of not having to remix certain colors over and over and over and over again. So try to get in the habit of doing that. When you've got a big mixture like this purple, I would take a little bit of the purple, start a new pile, and then adjust it the way that you want to, whether that's tinting with white or neutralizing with its complement or a little bit of both. Keep that in mind because you don't want to have to remake these bigger mixtures, too often. So anyway, now that I've done this, I've got a few new colors now that I can use in my painting. So, I had mentioned earlier that I want that really bright, intense yellow, like maybe this yellow for my sky in the painting. So I don't want to use that kind of a yellow anywhere else, right? I want to keep that as that part of my environment and my context. But when I'm looking at my sketch, my horizon line in the sketch is getting darker and darker and darker as I reach the horizon line. So there's this nice gradient that I have in my thumbnail. So I'm going to try to put that in right now using, let's see, maybe I'll use this bristle brush here to block in this gradient that I'm thinking of. And I can actually, I can use these two colors here to do that. So I think I'm going to start out by taking this sort of mustardy yellow along my horizon line and start to bring that down like this. So I have a little bit of my medium here next to my titanium white. You can hardly see it, but there's a little pile of that left there. I'm going to grab some of this kind of goldish color, thinning it out with the medium, not the Gamsol, right? Because I want to use this for its intense color properties. And basically I'm going to do a thin coat of this color towards that horizon line. Now you'll notice the way I'm holding my brush, right? I'm not painting it like this. I want to try to fill this shape in as fast as possible, just for the sake of efficiency of time. So when I load up my brush with this thinned out paint, I'm moving my brush in a vertical kind of movement like this, and I'm moving it from left to right. So basically that allows me to fill in this shape relatively quickly without needing to worry about accuracy of detail. This is a painting I'm going to make in layers, so it doesn't need to be perfect right away, right? That's what I've already told myself. It's like, okay, I can start out simple, and then I can start to refine things in, future layers of this painting. Okay, let's grab a little bit more of that medium, mix it in with this mustardy yellow. In my last recording that I just made today, I talked a little bit about brushes and some of the benefits between using a bristle brush, which is this stiff hair type of a brush, which is what I have right now, compared to using a synthetic softer hair brush or a natural hair brush. And if you're laying in a large passage of a color, especially with thin paint like this, I would recommend using a bristle brush for that. All right, so what I was just starting to imagine was like, what if this color down here was where most of the color of the kind of the waves and the bubbles and the ripples can be filled in with, you know, more of a muted, neutral, cooler, brownish tan. So I think I'm gonna make a little bit more of this color and basically create a gradient between this color here and this more cooler version. Now, the nice thing about using a limited palette like this is that we can always remix a color that we run out of. And if we've done it once, we can do it again, right? That's the beauty of learning how to mix colors that are from a limited palette, because you only have 3 choices, right? Every color that I mix on this palette is coming from 3 different colors, technically, right? Because I'm using this violet, this yellow, and this white. Now we know this violet is actually coming from 2 different pigments, right? So you could argue that there's 4 colors, but I'm not going to make any changes by dipping into just ultramarine blue or the quinacridone magenta, right? I'm just going to be using this violet when I'm mixing my colors for the painting. So because of that, it's really helpful for me to know how to get back to like this middle neutral. It's just a combination between this yellow and this violet. So if I run out of that middle mixture, I can always make more. Now if you have, let's say you have 10 colors on your palette and you make a pile and you run out, you know, if you're 3 days into a painting, you might forget how you made that color, especially if you're new to painting and you're not that familiar with those 10 colors. This is the big reason why we're starting with a very limited palette, but also why we're using a complementary palette, because we don't have a violet right out of a tube, right? Now, if you pick blue and orange, or if you pick red and green, the blue and orange, you might be able to use things right out of the tube, right? If, like with that example I showed of the other color chart, you can use a burnt sienna and an ultramarine blue, and they'll neutralize really, really well. And both of those pigments you can get right out of the tube. Now, if you use red and green, we don't have a green right out of a tube that's in our material list. You can purchase green paints, of course, but I am a believer in the idea that we learn more when we are involved with the materials earlier in the process. So if you have to make your own green, you're going to learn more than the person who is buying a green. That's just my general opinion. But that doesn't mean it's bad to buy secondary colors or tertiary colors. I think that's okay. But for the sake of this project, it's going to be really helpful for us to become a little bit more acquainted with our pigments and our colors within our palette for the class. Looks like I need to get a little bit more of my gel medium. I'll do that in just a second. Now you might be thinking, wow, there's not really a big gradient of value here, and that's okay. You know, you would be correct. There's the value between this zone and this zone is almost identical, right? Now, again, because this is going to be an indirect painting where I'm going to make this painting in multiple layers, it doesn't need to be perfect right off the bat, and hopefully you'll feel a sense of relief with your painting because it's not like you have to finish it in one go. You know, you have multiple weeks to work on your paintings. Okay, let's grab a little bit more medium. I can figure out where I put my medium. seem to have misplaced my gel medium. I guess I'll just keep painting without it for now, which, that's okay too. Something actually that I've thought about recently with our materials in our class and with just painting in general is that it can be really overwhelming when we think about the materials that we have access to, in general with oil painting materials, but just with the ones that we have in our kits for this class. Here we go, found it. But the point of what I was going to say is that, what I've found for me that's really helpful is limiting the variables is always going to simplify the process. So, if you don't use any additives with your paint, you're probably going to get a better feel for the paint itself. And that's a really good lesson, I think, because you can still do a lot with just the paint out of the tube in terms of making marks and manipulating the paint. So I would be hesitant towards getting in the habit of just like always adding something to the paint, right? I would encourage everyone to occasionally just use the paint without any additives, whether that's the medium or the Gamsol. Okay, so now if you saw, I just was adding a little bit more of the titanium white, and what I'm using right now is a technique that we would call scumbling. And basically it's very similar to a dry brush technique, but I don't have a lot of paint on my brush. Again, the benefit of using a bristle brush is that you can be kind of rough with it and it's not going to damage the brush as quickly as like a synthetic or softer hair brush. So, when I'm blocking in a painting and I'm just trying to cover up whatever the surface is, I like to use these types of brushes because I can just move really fast without having to overthink things. I can make adjustments pretty quickly, especially if I'm mixing with the brush, which is what you're watching me do right now. So, by neutralizing this mixture with a little bit of a cool white with our titanium, now I'm starting to create a little bit more of a temperature gradient, which hopefully you can notice on screen. As we move towards the horizon, the color gets warmer and slightly darker. And as we move towards the bottom of the design or the painting, things get slightly less chromatic, but also a little bit lighter in value, which is something that I really like about my sketch. So when you're sketching and drawing, value, because you're using graphite, most of what you're doing is controlling your values in your thumbnail until or unless you make a color study, right? So that allows you then to start to experiment with the color properties. But when you're just drawing with graphite, you're really thinking mostly about value and proportions. You're thinking about shape. You're thinking about character of shapes and lines and how to play with the space in your thumbnail without the use of color, right? Or without the use of hue and chroma. You still have value, technically. Okay, so now I'm starting to get like a nice block in of the painting, right? And it's very simple. This recording is almost at 50 minutes, so with the presentation stuff at the beginning and just talking about the process, I was able to get to this stage relatively fast, right? Which I hope is how your process also goes when you think about simplifying your composition. So again, if I take my thumbnail that I have as my reference here, we can really see the difference of information, right? And I've already shifted a couple of proportional things, right? In my sketch, the doorway was a little bit wider. I kind of like it more narrow in the painting, so I'm just going to follow the painting now for that part of the composition. And I haven't put any of the inside details in. I haven't started to paint any of the water ripples or that kind of texture yet. I'm not worrying about any of the small shapes in the foreground. It's all big shapes that I'm putting in right now. So when you start your painting, try to follow that same logic of information, right? Try not to get too worried about the details of whatever was in your thumbnail or your reference image. Okay, since I'm working mostly on the background still, I might as well go ahead and put that sky shape and that sky color in. So I'm going to grab a different brush that doesn't have paint on it because I don't want to, what's the term? I don't want to muddy up this sort of bright yellow that I'm going to use. So that's what I'll do right now is mix up that color. I'm going to take titanium white. And I need a decent amount of pigment to cover that area. So let's maybe grab a little bit more titanium white, and I can grab a little bit of my cadmium yellow medium. I'm going to start with a small amount because I want to keep this value pretty bright. I don't want this to be too dark and have to add more white. Now, again, this aspect of mixing our colors on our palette is going to create multiple examples of moments where you might think that your color that you're mixing is perfect. It makes sense because you're thinking about how that color relates to the environment of your palette, right? So this is very bright in comparison to this purple, and it's really bright in comparison to this darker brown. You know, but once I put it on a painting like this, you know, if I use my palette knife and I put this into the sky, all of a sudden now it's not as extreme of a value, right? And that's because the environment of that color has shifted dramatically. I mean, you can tell between the value of my palette to the value of my paper, that's a huge difference in terms of light and dark. So I would say get used to comparing your colors in the context on your palette, and then separately compare them to the context of the painting. I would try not to think, oh, this is the right color, and then you get to your painting and you go, why doesn't that work? You know, it's because it's a totally different comparison that you're making. So I wouldn't worry about that too much, but just know that that will happen every time you make a painting. That seems to happen. So I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. I'm going to grab a little bit of my medium to thin this out so I have a thin layer that I can put over that shape of the sky. And this is a soft brush. This is not a bristle hair brush. You know, hopefully you can see it's a little bit more of a softer hair. This is a flat brush, so I have a very square, flat tip and edge to this brush, which is going to be really helpful actually for filling in these tight corners on this, like, you know, very geometric shape that is the sky in my painting. All right, so now I'm just going to go through and start to cover this here. Now, what is probably most likely going to happen is that painting my sky is going to take a few passes of layers because this is a very bright color that I'm painting in. But also because, you know, it's really easy to tint and to sort of like mess with the properties of the color that I've mixed up, right? It doesn't, like, if there's a little bit of residue of this warmer kind of brown by the horizon, that's going to mix with this color, and if that's not what I want it to look like at the final part of my painting, I wouldn't try to fix it right now and like put a thick layer of paint down. Instead, I would just fill in the shape, let it dry for a day or two, or maybe a couple days or over the weekend, and then at a future point I would come back when it's dry, or dry to the touch at the very least, remix this color and then go over it, and that'll give you a really clean edge. Sometimes I think we want to fix something right away, and it can be frustrating when we're painting with oils because the paint is still wet, right? So, you know, if you're getting more of one color, you're just going to keep adjusting whatever's happening in your painting. And if you're used to painting with acrylics or gouache, another type of paint that dries really quickly, and you're used to being able to just go over something within a few minutes. That's not the case with oils. So this is another reason why it's really important when you're still kind of figuring things out in your painting to not use too much paint at this stage, right? All of my colors are really, really thin, and that's going to help those shapes dry really fast. Versus if I took a big blob of paint and put it down, that big chunk of oil paint is going to take a week, maybe longer, to dry because there's so much oil in that amount of paint, and because it's cold in my studio. In the summer, especially if you paint outdoors, you'll notice, or if your studio where you paint gets really hot, you'll notice that your painting will dry much faster than it does in the winter. And again, it's not like one is better than the other, but they're different environments and they're different in the ways that they affect your painting's process or your process as an artist in terms of what you can do at what time. But, again, the good thing is that as you continue to paint, some of that stuff just becomes expected, or it becomes like part of second nature to you, and you'll start to realize how to prepare for those variables in terms of your environment, in terms of your materials, in terms of the structure of your paintings. This is still a fairly technical assignment, and a lot of this assignment is really about color theory and about using principles of design and studying the work of other artists to heighten our awareness of color theory and principles of design. So, there's a lot of technical information that we're looking at, we're talking about, I'm presenting, and ideally that, you're really thinking about while you're working on this project and this painting. But again, in my experience, it helps to limit as many of the variables as possible. So if you don't have a palette of 5 colors and instead you only have 3 colors, I think it's just going to help us feel like it's easier to navigate the color mixing process and to be more intentional, right? Because it's like, if you want part of your painting to really stand out, right, in terms of, let's say, chroma, this yellow, and when I tint my purple, there's a point when I'm tinting up this purple that it starts to feel really, really vibrant and chromatic, like in this bottom right square. So when I'm thinking about my composition and the moment that I want someone to really get pulled into the painting, the chroma relationships can help with that, right, in terms of capturing someone's attention. So what I want to do is I want to be pretty conservative with that type of a color, right? And then these types of colors, these yellows at the top, that are also very chromatic, right? So what I've been doing so far is I've been trying to stay in a fairly muted, relative to those levels of chroma, a somewhat more muted range of colors. Now, obviously, we could say that these colors are very chromatic in relationship to a gray or other parts of the chart, but you'll notice that I didn't use just pure yellow in the sky, right? I'm saving that really, really vibrant yellow for a moment that I think it'll really be necessary to draw the viewer's attention. And that logic can be applied also to value as well, the way that we think about our lightest value and our darkest value, right, as a way of using contrast to pull your attention to a particular place, right? If I took some of this yellow and I put a splotch of that over one of these really dark purples, that interaction of color, like even just with the brush, right, it's like that level of contrast there is tremendously powerful compared to this level of contrast, right, with the lighter purple and the darker purple. Part of that is because we're using a complementary color that's so different in terms of its hue to the purple, right? So it's a value thing and it's a hue, like temperature thing as well. that's creating that level of contrast. And when we have a kind of a familiar understanding of those principles of color theory, it makes the painting process a little bit more feasible in terms of organizing your steps, right? You don't have to worry about so many parts of the process all at the same time. You can sort of like compartmentalize what you're going to be doing at what time. Okay, so that's pretty good for right now. You know, as I was putting in this shape over here, I realized that it felt like this horizon line was slightly lower than the right side, and I want that to be a bit more level. So what I was really looking at was the distance between this top corner and my horizon line here, and the same on this side, the top corner to what the horizon line should be. And it felt like this distance when it was here was longer than here to here, right? Hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. But okay, let's keep on moving here. So as I mentioned before, I really want this area in here to be much colder in temperature. So what I'm going to do is mix up, and I'm looking down at my reference again here. I'm going to mix up a very bright violet because I want there to be space for a sky in this, doorway scene. So I'm going to take pure white and a little bit of purple, and we'll see what kind of value we get. I've noticed that this violet combination with the pigment that I'm using for my painting, it might be different for your painting, and that's typically because there's a difference between student grade paint, whether it's acrylic or oil or any other type of paint, compared to artist grade paint or professional grade paint. The biggest difference is the amount of pigment in either tube of paint. And in artist grade paint, there's a lot more pigment, therefore there's a lot higher tinting strength. This is just like a general description, and depending on which two tubes you combine or compare, that could be debunked, but I'm just pointing out that if you make a violet, you might notice different levels of tinting strength for that reason. So just again, as a way of becoming familiar with the medium and the materials, it's something to think about. Okay, so in my sketch, the sky is fairly light in value, so I'm going to use this tinted violet here for my sky in the painting. So I have a new brush. There's no paint on the brush, but I'm going to thin it out with a little bit of my medium again. So you'll notice I haven't used Gamsol now for a long time. I only used it to do the line work in the painting, and now I've sort of cut it out of the process. I don't need it anymore, and I'm going to use medium, the gel medium now, if I need to thin out the paint or to help make it spread farther in the painting. So I kind of want to see what this looks like. I think a violet, that's pretty dark even compared to the yellow in the sky. It's also a little too chromatic for my liking right now. So I'm going to take more white and a little bit of that kind of mustard yellow, and I'm going to just mix that right into that pile that I had before to try to create a little bit more of a neutral. And again, the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want to use my most chromatic violet yet. I want to save it because there might be a detail somewhere in this part of the painting that I really want to emphasize through chroma. Okay, I'm going to wipe off my brush. I'm not going to use Gamsol, right? I'm just going to take my paper towel and squeeze out as much of the paint as possible. Let's grab the medium again. Now, a question that you might have is how much medium is an appropriate amount of medium to mix into our paint? And it's a really good question because we can end up making the paint that we want to put into the painting with medium mixed in. We can end up making that a little too oily and then it might be difficult for subsequent layers to grip onto whatever you just put into the painting. So I would always, again, be conservative with that as well. Like I wouldn't get in the habit of using a lot of medium when you want to thin out your paint. I would experiment more with your brushes and your tools if you're unable to spread the paint around a particular part of your painting. I would change the tool. Maybe you can do that with more of a bristle brush as opposed to a synthetic kind of flexible soft brush. The other thing I would recommend is to use more paint. A lot of times we are precious with our materials and we're not afraid, but we're just really aware of how much material we have left when we're working. And if there's one piece of advice that I could give to painting students, it's to use the materials that you've bought, right? A lot of times I'll talk to artists who went to art school or students that are still in art school who are, almost graduating or they just recently graduated, and they, sometimes after 5 years from graduating, they still have all of their paint and they haven't used any of it. And it's like, I'd rather hear stories of somebody that has 100 paintings, but they had to keep buying paint, right? It's like the paint is there to be used. It's not there to be collected. So I know it can feel really daunting at the start of a semester to use a lot of paint, but the amount of paint that I just used here isn't anything crazy, right? And there's still some of that mixture, and I'm almost done filling this in on this part of my painting. But that's the thing I would be mindful of while you're working, is maybe you just don't have enough paint down on your palette to then put into your painting. But again, just full transparency, like as the instructor of the class, this is why I prefer to use oil paint, because if we were working with acrylic paint, anything you don't use that you can't get back into the tube or a container, or if you don't have like a stay wet palette that will keep your paint wet for longer than a week, there's a higher likelihood that you're going to waste material and you're going to waste your paint. So with oils, it's a little bit more open right out of the tube than an acrylic tube of paint will be. But again, I that's just my opinion, and I know that there are palettes out there that are designed to help preserve acrylic paint. So thankfully nowadays there is pretty good amount of technology to kind of offset some of that stuff. But anyway, I'm kind of getting off track. So back to the painting now. I like this color. It's a little bit more muted, but it complements the sky in a way that I really like. Just in terms of an abstract color relationship, there's some interesting plays with the level of values in these two shapes. I think it's satisfying just in terms of a geometric relationship. So now what I can do is I think I'm going to just sort of tone this whole section of the doorway with a slightly, maybe a slightly darker, slightly warmer, mixture between this mixture and whatever I was doing over here. And part of that is just to kind of get rid of all of this open space that's still on the surface. So let's go ahead and grab a little bit of yellow and a little bit of white and a little tiny bit of purple from the edge of this purple pile. Put some medium in here. Let's see how this looks. Yeah, that looks pretty good. This is probably going to be close to what my fence looks like in the painting. I might make it a little bit cooler, but just for now, it's not too cool, it's not too warm. It's in a kind of a nice middle ground between both ends of my palette. And then we can bring this all the way down to the bottom of what I'm feeling like is going to be the fence, the closest fence. I did just kind of mention briefly that I think I might adjust my design to also have multiple layers of fences in the painting. I think that would be kind of interesting if there were like 3 or 4 or 5, tops of fences behind this one. I think that would be really interesting. So what I might do here is just kind of do a soft blend into the color of the sky, because I haven't quite figured out that part of the painting yet. So this way, they're connected. There's a nice little gradient. I can adjust something relatively easily here, and maybe I can go back to this other softer flat brush here and just kind of soften this transition a little bit more, or at the very least make it a little bit more organic. That way, if I paint over parts of this, it's not as noticeable that there was this like clean divide from before. So whenever I hit a point like this in a painting where I'm not quite sure what I want to do, I think it makes more sense to just sort of like ease the transition of the two different zones of that part of the painting than just put like a hard boundary. For me, I think there's two reasons why I lean this way. Is because one, if that line that you make with the paint dries and you paint over it, you might still see that line underneath whatever you paint, and that can be really frustrating. Sometimes you can get rid of it by like scraping it off with a palette knife after it's dry. That's not a big deal. The other reason is visually it can be really stark and distracting, and it can kind of like get in the way of visualizing what else you might want to do instead. So that's the other reason why I would recommend giving yourself the opportunity to like make adjustments later by softening some of those transitions. Now you might be able to tell too that the top part of the shape is more opaque than the bottom part of the shape. So for me that's important because I already know that the sky is going to be kind of a solid, relatively solid passage of color. And I don't want to be able to see information through that color, even at this point in the painting process. Now, these other shapes, it's not as big of a deal. I might even choose to leave some of that thin, translucent paint the way that it is. It kind of has a very like delicate, flowy texture that we can maybe use to convey water and ripples of water and that kind of thing. All right, the last thing I want to do for sure in this recording is to fill in this shape and then the smaller one at the base of the painting. And this is basically what I'm envisioning is the beach of the paint of the water subject here. So hopefully you can see, in the design I have this darker value that would be kind of like a sandy sort of color and texture. I like the idea that it's going to be darker than the water, so that means it's going to have to be pretty dark, at least for right now. But more importantly, I want to make sure that it doesn't read as the same information and material as what I'm seeing are these ripples and bubbles of water, which, that's going to take time to build up those details. But for right now, the important thing is to distinguish that this shape is different than these shapes around it. So I'm going to make a color that's slightly more purple or violet and darker than what I have here. And I can always lighten up the sand if I need to later. So again, for me, it's just more important to differentiate those two parts of the composition. So let's go ahead and grab a little bit of purple. Let's mix that here. I'm just going to pick kind of a random spot between other pools. This is a term that I use a lot, which is referring to like a color that you've mixed on your palette. I like to call these pools, and you can mix one into the other one, kind of like this, if you want to sort of find their middle mixture. That's pretty easy to do, and it's a really useful way of organizing our palettes. Sometimes when I grab a color and I just put it down over two other piles, I'm doing that intentionally. It kind of feels random, or it might look random, but it's intentional so that I pick up some of the other pigments that are in those parts of my palette. And again, it's a way to create some harmony through my mixtures and through whatever ends up on the surface of my painting, because I don't want anything to feel too different at this point. I want to make sure that it still feels fairly harmonious overall. Grab a little bit of white just to lighten this up, because that purple was way too dark before. There's not a lot of pigment here, so I should probably grab a lot more paint. Now that's getting back into like a more chromatic violet, so now I know I need to add more of a yellow or one of these other yellows that I've mixed from other amounts. Let's grab some of this one here. That looks pretty good. I like what this color is doing, so I'm going to use this and I'll thin it out a little bit, right? I don't want to use anything that's too thick or opaque. It's just going to be harder to adjust and change, so I'm going to get some of my gel medium just to make this flow a little bit more thinly and smoothly. And let's go ahead and start blocking this in here and seeing how it feels. Again, this is that same idea of like it might feel way different in the painting than it did on the palette, because everything around it is much brighter and a lot more muted, so I can tell that's too dark already, right? And it's too purple. So I'm going to grab more of these other kind of goldish colors, mix those in here, and I'm going to add more white to this. Just use the rest of my white that I have on the palette. While I'm at it, I might as well use some of that sky color, which is good because that'll help kind of create more harmony between the beach sand and the sky in the doorway. I can take my palette knife and I can just kind of place that on here. Now that's a pretty opaque little passage of paint, so what I can do, I can opt to use one of the bristle brushes, and I can basically like spread that paint around and thin it out. So in this way, the paint is more of like a stain on the surface of the paper, and it's less of an opaque color that is sitting on top of the paper. So when we paint, we'll start to kind of experiment with the difference of a color. Like this color is going to be different if it's thin versus if I put it on thick like that, right? Those are very different properties. This is much darker and it doesn't feel as warm. This background color feels warmer in comparison. So, you know, even though they're both the same color, depending on how much you're using is going to make it feel very, very different in the painting. So that's something to experiment with this painting as well, because you have a limited palette. I think it's a good time to kind of play around with like how thick to put the paint on the surface for different reasons. But now this is starting to feel a lot less in your face. It doesn't feel quite as purple. It's got a little bit more of the yellow in it, so it's not quite as big of a jump from its neighboring area, but it also feels different than the shapes of what I'm thinking of as the water. I'm not concerned with keeping the shapes perfect, right? It's hard to get a nice clean edge with a brush this size, so I recommend thinking about it the same way when you're doing this in your paintings. Try not to worry too much about getting it right the first time, because you can always paint over it and fix it, or maybe you'll do something that you like that you wouldn't have done had you used a different tool, or if you were trying to just finish the painting in one session. I would try to be open to using multiple layers in this painting, right? By thinking about this as an open painting where you can always adjust what you have later on. Honestly, the other thing that's kind of interesting to think about, depending on what you're painting, you know, it might make sense to put a little bit of that color. You know, when I say that color, I'm talking about this color that I'm using right now, right? It kind of makes sense for me to leave a little bit of this color in this part of the painting, because I'm describing water that at times is translucent, right? Depending on the lighting, depending on how much water there is. You know, if I can make it feel like this is a little bit transparent or translucent, then it'll feel more real, and it'll feel like this color is under the water, right? Like as sand would normally be. So this is where once you have a shape and you kind of have a boundary in your painting of how things are supposed to be, if you soften that boundary, you can actually make things feel more connected to one another in a weird way. So when you don't have a lot of paint on the surface, it's much easier to manipulate and to adjust these kinds of things as well. Because again, this first layer for me is just all about building context so that I understand what it is I'm trying to do in the painting. So if I can make this foreground feel a lot more sort of intertwined, then I can always come back later and pull out shapes and make new shapes on top of this that feel more unique and different, and serves a different function and purpose. So I'm pretty happy with that idea and how this is looking now. The other thing is that by softening the edges, it makes things feel a lot more flexible, right? And it makes it feel like, oh, I can totally adjust, and I can pivot, I can make something angle a different way. It doesn't feel like it's going to stand out because everything else was really resolved. By keeping these edges somewhat atmospheric and soft like this, it's going to make the next layer feel a little bit easier to get back into and to start painting again. So that's something I also would recommend as you're blocking in your paintings, is to try not to make anything too defined, too clear, too sharp. Because when you continue to work on the painting, the next layer, those next marks, those next colors can often feel out of place, and then it can be really challenging to figure out, how do I fix this? How do I adjust? Or why isn't this connecting the way that I want it to? Excuse me. One thing I want to do before I stop today is I want to really commit to my horizon line a little bit more with a darker color. So let's see, that seems a little too dark. Let's grab a little bit of white and some of this residue of that gold that was up in this left corner here. Still a little bit dark. Let's grab some yellow, a little bit of white, so I keep it, I don't want it to seem too chalky. I want to keep this whole outside feel a lot warmer. So I'm grabbing some yellow. I need to fix my backboard here on my easel so that it doesn't click every time I push down. Sorry if that's distracting noise that's coming through. Now, the other thing I was thinking about, I didn't do this in preparation for today, but sometimes what really is useful is if you're painting something you're not that familiar with, like, you can paint from your imagination for sure, but if you want something to feel more real, it can be really helpful to gather some reference material. So you can, appropriate imagery that you find as reference material for parts of your painting. You can use your own photographs. You can look at other historical paintings just to get ideas for how you want to solve describing a certain form in space. And this is especially true for those of us who are working more representationally with this particular assignment, but like it would be helpful to source images of water, like bodies of water, and I'm kind of just going off of my experience of painting Lake Michigan over the last couple of summers, and the way that I remember the values shifting from top to bottom. So that's kind of where my mind is at right now as I'm putting these colors in here. But I'm also just going to keep this a bit more chromatic as this comes down into our lighter zone at the bottom of the painting. Now, I'm not using very much paint. It's all pretty thin. That way I can really gauge how much paint I need to shift the color of something, right? And to make it feel a little bit more vibrant in the way that I want. Because the paint is still wet, you know, my yellow on the brush that I'm kind of putting on here is mixing with the paint that's on the surface of my painting. So they're creating their own little like mini middle mixture as I'm brushing this through the painting. Which is another reason why I feel like it's really helpful to start by blocking in large shapes of color to create the context. And then you can always go into it while it's still wet like this and make these more subtle adjustments to the color. But we'll see how I feel about this in the next day or two. I might decide to lighten this value or darken the color of the sky at the horizon. It feels a little too, high contrast for me right now. I'd like it to feel a little bit more atmospheric, so chances are I might try to allude to like more of a hazy gradient from the horizon up into the sky, or just darken the value of the sky altogether. I might wait to do that until I figure out what's happening in the doorway. So just to kind of cue you into the process that's going through my head, how I'm thinking about the painting evolving, and as an example of ways that we can let go of some of the control and agency of the process, right? Because I think it's fun to be in control from start to finish of our paintings and our work, but it's also fun to not know what's going to happen and to leave certain things kind of open to decide later. So when you're working, feel free to be somewhat at the mercy of the process, right? Don't feel like you have to always know where the painting is going, or you always have to stick to a plan that you've already decided in your sketchbook or the moment you started painting. Things can change, right? And this is true of a lot of creative endeavors, but especially with painting. Every mark and change that we make kind of reestablishes the context of the whole image. And, that's where painting is, I think it's most useful as a medium, as a experience, as a practice, as a thing that we engage with in terms of a process. It can teach us ways of being a little bit more collaborative with ourselves or with this outer, external thing that we're trying to push around and, combine with new ideas. And, regardless, I'm happy with where this is at right now. Just for the sake of practicality, something I like to do at the end of a session is clear the palette. So I'll take piles of colors that are still large enough that it makes sense to keep them. I'll make a pile kind of like that with one single color. I'll do this with some of these other middle mixtures, like with this kind of warm gray. I have a little bit of a color that was saved from when I made my chart over here, and that's still wet, so I'm just going to mix that in with the rest of the paint on the palette. And honestly, one thing that's really fun to do is to scrape everything that's still wet on your palette like this and mix all of it together into one big, unique, muted mixture. And there's a couple of big benefits why this is helpful, and or reasons to do this. So one right away that's coming to mind is you're not wasting your paint, right? You're not just going to wipe this off with a paper towel and then discard your paper towel. You can still use this paint as long as it's still wet. So you might as well, keep some of the longevity of your pigment as long as possible by doing this and saving it. Especially the other benefit is if you're not done with your painting, right? You're going to come back and work on this painting. That color that I just saved is going to be inherently harmonious to the painting, because most of the pigment that I just played with to make these shapes are, like those pigments together are in this mixture, right, to different degrees, right? It's not super yellow, it's not super violet, but it's a nice middle between the two. So I can use this now kind of as like a convenient color to make adjustments to something else that I'll be mixing in the future. So that's a really helpful practice to start using and doing now. That way it becomes a habit. And I think it'll also be really practical anytime you're using a limited palette and you're wanting to keep harmony in your painting. But once you're done with your painting session, then you can wipe off whatever's left on your palette. I briefly covered this in one of my other meetings or lectures with all of you who are in my painting class. But this is a old piece of MDF that at one point was supposed to be a panel for a painting, and then I forgot a palette one day. This was like 8 years ago. I was plein air painting in Arizona, and I got out to this beautiful park. I had hiked like a mile and realized I didn't have a palette, and just used one of my panels that I had gessoed and primed as a palette. And ever since then, it's kind of just become a palette. And when you use a piece of wood like that, that's especially if it's primed and sanded smooth, over time, many painting sessions have been used with this palette. But every time I wipe it down, basically it's like burnishing the oil from the paint into the surface, and it's polishing the surface. So you end up with this like really kind of like almost glass-like surface for a palette. And it's just something I wanted to point out, that you don't need a fancy palette. You don't need a very glass, like fragile kind of palette. You can use those types of palettes too, but you can also get away with just using a piece of MDF gessoed wood like I've been doing for a long time. So this is the palette I use when I'm teaching and I need like a vertical palette. The little holes are here so I can hang this on a wall when I'm not using it. But anyway, just wanted to point that out. So that's the end of this recording. Thank you for those of you who tuned in while I was painting. I hope, again, this was helpful and useful. This is, again, intended for primarily students that I'm teaching online through university this semester, but I figure this information is useful for anyone who wants to get better at painting or is looking for fundamental exercises and approaches and methods to studying things like composition, color theory, and all sorts of other fun things. So my name's Hector Acuna. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you're interested in following this particular painting and this assignment, chances are, I don't want to make any promises, but chances are I'll record future sessions with this painting here on YouTube. If you don't find them, if I decided not to do that, then there's another chance this will be posted somewhere on social media or on my website at some point down the road. So anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.